Okay. Right. So, well, first, are there any questions that I can answer before I go over the sample? Okay. Hearing none. The also the thing to understand about the sample is that it's kind of an indication of what I was the kind of things that I ask on a midterm. Um, but that may have to be modified a little bit. I received a request to that you be able to use NetBeans for the exam. I asked that it not be used, and there was a request that NetBeans be used. So here's the thing about that is that impacts the kind of questions that I'm going to ask. In other words, if you can use NetBeans, then there are some questions that you can answer just by sort of typing it into NetBeans. So that's not what I'm after here. So what that means is that I'm going to have to ask questions that you're not going to be able to answer just by typing it to NetBeans. So just be aware of that. So um, having said that, since it was requested and there seemed to be a good reason why some of you want to use NetBeans, I'm okay with that. Again, just with the understanding that like some of the questions on the sample midterm then would be ones that I wouldn't ask because they were things that you could just sort of type into NetBeans and run. So that doesn't get at what I'm after. What I'm after here are just the concepts that you've really absorbed and learned. So with that understanding, is there any well, I'm not going to ask you to do it publicly, but privately, if there are any objections to that, either send it to me in the chat or send me an email or something like that. But for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you to use NetBeans, and just understand that what that means is that some of the questions that I was asking on the sample midterm then would not, those types of questions wouldn't be there because they could just be simply answered by typing the code. So okay, so just to go over what some of the questions were. Again, the first one was just sort of a basic coding question about for loops. So want to print the multiples of either 3 or 5 that are less than 1,000. So the idea is, well, first you have a for loop, and again, less than 1,000 is a little bit ambiguous. So do you start at 0 or do you start at 1? Again, I wasn't trying to be tricky, so this is fine. Because I said less than 1,000, then this would be less than. If I said less than or equal to 1,000, then this could either be less than or equal to, or I would make this, you'd have to make this 1,001. Again, that as some of you have experienced in some of the uh, computer assignments, understanding what the limits of for loops are about is important to get. Here, again, the idea that this was just combining a for loop and an if. So the if uses this modulo operator, which you're all familiar with. And so a multiple of 3 is if the modulo 3 is 0, and a multiple of 5 is modulo 5, and then here's a Boolean operator. So this was just sort of a basic programming question that really can be, is applicable in any language. You know, if I were to ask you to do this in JavaScript, then it would look very, the only difference would be you wouldn't have this int declaration here, and you would probably just say print or, you know, output it to a web page or something like that. Okay, so now what this one was tricky. And what this one was about was understanding what integer division is about. So this is kind of the tricky one right here. So even though the loop was iterating over all of the length of the array, which was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it would execute 5 times. The first time it would be 0/2, and so that would be the 0th one. The second time it would be 1/2, which is also 0, and that would give again, this guy here. So the thing is that the output is not what you would expect. You know, kind of at first glance, it looks like you're going to get all of the 5 guys, but in fact, because of this little thing here, and because of integer arithmetic, you're only going to get these things here. So that's so what's the lesson there? Be careful of integer arithmetic, especially division. Okay, so this question 3 was about just understanding the relationship between these UML diagrams and the code. So so the first part, what are the setters and or getters for the instance variables? And because we assume each instance variable can be modified, what that translates into is that you do want to have setter methods. And so it is just very straightforward. Again, the getter for width, you just return width. The setter, now there are 2 options for setters like this, or passing arguments in. One is to use the same name, and if you do that, you have to say this if you use the same name. If you use a different name, then this is optional. It's important to understand that. And the concept here is that this, even though you have 2 variables of the same name, this variable as an argument is syntactically like a local variable. In other words, this width is not the same as the instance variable width. So that's important to understand, and that also ties in with this concept of scope that I've talked about a lot. In other words, the scope of this instance variable would be the entire class. We don't see the entire class here, but all methods have access to the instance variable width, whereas this argument width has only access, the only scope of that is in one call to the setWidth method. So that, you know, the concept here, there are several things. One is understand the scope of arguments versus the scope of instance variables. And then the second one is understanding that the difference between a local variable or argument and an instance variable here, even though what this shows is they can be the same name, but if you're trying to use a variable of a given name within a method, it will always use the local variable will kind of shadow the instance variable. In other words, if you didn't have this, if you just said width equal width, then it would just take the argument, set it equal to itself, and then leave the instance variable unchanged. So that's another thing that you need to know. Okay, so we had height, width, color, and rotation. They all, basically just very straightforward. Okay, so then I asked to implement the scale by method. With the idea here is that the height and width are to be scaled by the given amount. So what does that typically do? What do you do when you scale something? You just kind of multiply it. So the width and the height would both be multiplied by the argument that's passed in here. That would be that one. And then this was, I realized, a little bit ambiguous, but I mean, all I was after here is the fact that here, if I say, okay, I now want to sort of set the rotation to be incremented by this amount, then I want to just simply add at that. Where would something like this come in if you're, you've all no doubt used these graphics programs where you can kind of, okay, rotate it by a little bit amount, and it will just kind of do that. Like here, like we're not dealing with displaying graphics here. So how to display a shape that's rotated by a certain amount, that actually involves some trigonometry and some other stuff, and those kinds of things you will learn about in your graphics class. We won't really delve into that. At some point, we will talk about how Java does graphical user interfaces, but we won't do a deep dive into the specific way that graphics are manipulated in Java. They actually can be, but again, there's a whole class in graphics that you'll be taking at some point if you haven't already. Okay, so now 4 was okay. What I've done here is just the main question was that it violates one or more of the important conventions. And again, it wasn't a matter of syntax, although that was a little bit of an issue depending. Conventions, there are important conventions here. Okay, the first was that the instance variables were not declared to be private. And I mean, I noticed in the last computer assignment, there were actually a couple of cases where instance variables were not declared to be private. And, I gave them a little bit of a ding in terms of points, but this is a critical element of what object-oriented programming is about. It's the principle of encapsulation, and the idea these must be made private. Instance variables must be made private. So I mean, if one of the things that I really want that you need to really get is that instance variables are private. Okay, now the second one is that that instance variables must be initialized in the constructor. That was something which I've kind of talked about, where you can initialize them in the declaration here, but in the conventions for this course, instance variables are initialized in the constructor. So in this particular class, the name was immutable. That is, it didn't have a setter, but the instance variable, the array of courses, did have a setter. And so generally when possible, you should use the setter method.
Arnie, I had a question for just kind of how you want us to do this in the test. I guess you're giving us a Word doc. Is it easier just to type it in? Or is there going to be some drawing and arrows we got to put on there?
I'm not quite following the question.
So yeah, I mean, you're gonna give us a Word doc, I assume.
No, it'll be a Sakai one. You'll be entering things direct. there will be things where there'll be a field and you'll be typing things into the field.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Yeah, those are okay. Those can be a little bit tricky when you start doing like code stuff in there.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I realize that. Yeah,
okay.
this, was when this was a pencil and paper, and actually the format of this, each question was kind of on a separate page, and there was like a big blank space for people to kind of write on, which is easier than typing in that thing. And unfortunately, I can't do that because we can't meet face to face.
We
So
we have, just because we've been doing this for the last 6 months, we have taken a lot of our tests that way. And we can, I don't know if you want to leave 5 minutes aside at the end for discussion on this topic. This taking the test, quizzes are kind of okay in Sakai, but when we start doing like tests where there's a lot of typing, it has been challenging. But a lot of times the instructors have given us like a Word doc or a Adobe, and so it's similar to the way we took tests, back in history when we used to sit in front of each other. And then we would just fill it in and scan it and send it back to you. So that's how most of our courses have done it.
okay, I'm certainly open to that.
Okay. Just
Yeah.
yeah, question at the end. But I know I've struggled with just once we've had a couple tests on Sakai. Usually the professor doesn't do it again.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't think I could assume that everybody, for example, would have a scanner. Does everybody have a scanner that they could do that with?
People are just taking pictures with their phones.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, we can upload it into Microsoft Lens. It goes directly into our OneDrive. That's how I've been doing it. I think some of the guys have, and then some of the guys just have like a straight scanner.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's, yeah. The only downside for me is that the phone ones are really hard for me to read, but that I would, okay. I wasn't aware of that option. I'm certainly open to that. So yeah, let's talk about that after.
If you wish, maybe we could do a poll at the end real quick just to
Yeah.
see what your thoughts are.
I plan on just typing my answers on the Word document. Like Brian was saying, Sakai is a little clunky to use.
That would work for me if you can make that work. Trying to think of how. Well, I get what I could do. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me. Yeah, I'm all for that. Unless somebody objects. So the idea would be, I would post a Word document that would have a certain time limit, and the idea is that you would. I think on the tests, like on the Sakai test, there's an option to upload a file. So is that how you how do you get the file back to the instructor?
There is. We've done it a couple different ways. Sometimes we've been given it as an assignment, and we've just uploaded it like we upload our normal assignments. And sometimes there is a like one question, here's your question, and like the Word doc is in the test. You can open the Word doc, and then you can scan it and upload it back. And then generally, if we have problems with getting it uploaded, we've just emailed the document to the professor.
Okay, yeah. All right. Well, that this again, this is kind of my first time kind of doing this class this way, so this is all very helpful. So and if yeah, so if there are no objections, I'll just need to do a little bit of research myself, just playing around with how to make sure that works. So, but that, yeah, a Word document, and then You can either type it in or you can print it and write on it and scan it and send it back. That would work for me.
So would you be okay with, could you post it like a few minutes early? I think me and one other student, we have Wi-Fi printers, so I actually have to disconnect my internet so I can download it and print it off. But that's an issue I run into with whenever.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I could do that. I could schedule it to kind of open a little early, like it might open before I come on, but I can definitely do that.
Yeah, Arnie, that's kind of what we've gotten from some of the. Usually, the first test is kind of a mess, and then a lot of our professors have been opening it like 5 or so minutes later whenever we have to download it, and to kind of give us, so we're not getting tested on how well we can download and upload documents.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's there are too many things outside of our control for that. Okay, so yeah, so I think, yeah, what I'd like to do is, and I'll have to play around with this after the class, on the tests and quizzes link. What I'm thinking is I'll create the midterm test I'll have it open a few minutes early. It'll have the Word document as an attachment, and the submission will be that you upload a file, and the file will be the one that you download and fill in. Is that roughly what you've been dealing with?
Similar, yeah. We've done it a couple different ways.
Okay.
With MBHX, I think that's pretty standard for us at this point.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. And that, to be honest, I like that. The Sakai thing for the quizzes, it's kind of okay. For tests, it's kind of a pain in the butt. Okay, so back to this. Yeah, this is another thing I've kind of been haranguing about, and that is that if you have an instance variable that's an array, and any setter or getter for that should always use a clone. So in this was the getter for the course array, and that should return a clone, which wasn't there. And likewise for this.
How does it, for the setter, so you're just cloning what's being passed into it?
Yes. Yeah, so the argument is an array of courses in this case, and every array you can just clone and it'll return an array of the right kind. So if you remember, there was a class where I showed how if you don't do this, that can be an encapsulation breach. Because remember what is this is a reference to this specific array that gets passed in. The method that calls this calls it with that reference. So even though this is a copy of that reference, it still refers to exactly the location where these objects are. If in the calling method that array gets modified, then if you don't clone it, then that will also modify what this instance variable is, and that violates encapsulation. And the principle of encapsulation is that the only things that should change an instance variable are methods in the class. The only thing that should change the value of an instance variable are methods that are in the class. And if you don't have this clone, then you can change the value of this instance variable outside of this object. And that's a violation of encapsulation is literally what it means. To encapsulate something is to kind of keep it well encapsulated. So
the same if the calling side or the class that's passing in the argument, what if they cloned it before they passed it? Would that work the same way?
Well, I mean, It could. The thing is that this has no control over whether over who calls it. If I have a public method, then any method anywhere that has a reference to this object can invoke this. And I have no control, this class has no control over whether they are or aren't doing that. And even if they do clone it, they still have a reference to that clone, and they could change that clone. The point is that the principle, again, is that any instance variable should only be changed by invoking a method. By doing this, I'm saying, okay, you can change this array of courses by creating one and passing it in. That's, I'm going to allow that. However, if you could inadvertently change this outside of the method without calling the setter. In other words, the idea of setters is that should be the single point of where this instance variable gets changed. So if you're trying to debug a program, and at some point this instance variable got changed, then this is if you abide by the principle of encapsulation, then every change has to go through a call to this method. If you don't have this clone, then it's possible to change this value without calling this method.
So
yeah, somebody started a comment, but
at this point you have two separate arrays created, and then the array that is being sent in can then be modified and someone can do whatever they want with it, but the one inside of this class is now owned by this class.
Exactly, yes. Yes, I mean, because as far as this object doesn't know or care what the other classes are doing with this variable. But it cares only to the, I mean, by cloning it, it's like, now I don't care what you do to this array that you just passed in. You could muck with it, you could change it, you add or remove stuff to it. I don't care because that's not going to affect me. And the reason why that's I mean, the principle encapsulation didn't sort of arise in a vacuum. It arose because in writing large programs, variables would just be changing in all kinds of different places. And when you're trying to track down why is a variable, something that you don't want, then by first enforcing encapsulation, which means that for this object, the only ways to change the variables are through these setter methods, then you have more discipline, and you have more control, and you have more ability to figure out what happens when something goes wrong. Because again, if the only way to change this variable is by calling this method, then I can identify all places where this method is being called, and those are the only places where this value is going to be changed. Okay, but really the takeaway is, if you have any argument that's an array that gets passed in to a method, then that should always be cloned. So that was also true up here in the constructor. So you notice that even the constructor called the setter method. Why? Because even if I'm just instantiating one of these guys, that array still goes through the setter method. Okay, so that, I mean, this is, you've heard me harangue about this a lot. So that should tell you that it's something that I consider to be important.
Yeah, Arnie, I had a question about that though, because I don't remember using the setter method for the constructor. We just did, we would pass in. Were we just doing it wrong the whole time? Because I thought even when you were doing code for us, like this dot name equals name.
Well, yeah, okay, good
So,
point. Yeah, well, here's the thing.
An object or an array that could be, because it's immutable.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, the
okay. So if it's immutable, you don't need the setter method in the constructor. If it's not, so if it's immutable, then you do.
yes. Yeah. So let me just underscore that. Yeah, immutable, like in this case, once I construct this student with a given name, there's no way that can be changed if I make it private. See now, if I leave it unprivate, then other classes can just go in and change the name. I mean, that's something that's because they'll have access to it. But by making it private, that means that nobody can touch that, which means that your name can't be changed. Now, you say, well, maybe you could go to the courthouse and change your name or something like that. But that, the idea is what you said. If I have a variable which is immutable, then I don't have a setter. Because see, as soon as I have a setter, then I'm allowing it to be changed by somebody else. I'm allowing that. It just has to go through this setter method. But for name cannot be changed. And so the only way that I can, so if it can't be changed, how do I set it? Well, you set it in this case would be through the constructor. We saw the same thing in the single card. The single card, the suit and the value were both immutable. They did not have setter methods. And so we had to set those in the constructor. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's a very good point. If something is immutable, then it's the best practice is to use the setter, because what that does is that means that even if I'm just instantiating one of these guys, this array still has to go through this setter method. In other words, the only places where this instance variable is being changed is in the setter method, a single point of failure. And that's generally a good design. Because if I have a single point of, well, I mean, for this type kind of thing, if I have a single point of failure in a program, then when it fails, I know exactly where, everything has to go through this one bottleneck here. I mean, obviously, if I'm doing something like designing a bridge or something, then I don't want a single point of failure, but that's building bridges, not writing code. Okay, so yeah, now here, see, in the original one, I think the constructor was there wasn't even a constructor. So, and so there are really kind of two answers depending on if you're running the original code or if you're running the revised code. So in the original code, this would run, but give a null pointer exception. Why would it give a null pointer exception? Because of this line right here. So what did you have to understand in order to figure out what's going on? Well, in the original code, again, there was no constructor. This wasn't there in the original code. So this would be allowed because there was a 0 argument constructor. But what happens when you try to print it? Okay, well, one thing you need to remember is that when I print an object, it invokes the toString method. So now in this case, again, when there was an empty constructor and the courses array was not initialized, then as soon as you try to execute this, there would be a null pointer exception. Now, if you modified it and then added this constructor, then you would get a compile error because there is no empty argument constructor.
On a test, would you specify like code pre being fixed or like the actual code that's currently there?
Yes, if I ask a question like this, then I will specify whether or not, you know, to run the original or the modified code. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now this one has to do with the difference between a list and a set. So here was a set, and here was a list, and then here's an array. And so what I did was the for loop adds the name to both the list and the set. And what do you get when you print them? So first the list will print them in the order that they're added. And that would be Humphrey, Paul, Ingrid, Paul, Claude, Humphrey, because that's the order that the array was in. The sorted set would print them in alphabetical order, actually lexicographic order, but that, you know, so that would take the same strings, but it would sort them according to alphabetical. And because there were two Humphreys, there would only be one in the set. So what you needed to know to answer this question was first that for a list, the items were added in the order that they were given, and that order was specified by the array. And then second, two things about a set. One is that a set cannot contain duplicates. So there were two duplicates. There was a duplicate here. I mean, there was one duplicate, and that duplicate would not appear in the set. And then the second is that a sorted set, or a tree set being the instance, would display them in alphabetical order. Technically lexicographic order, but you know, alphabetical was enough here. And the well, I was tempted to ask a bonus, to have a bonus one, which is does anybody know the relationship between these different names?
Weren't they all on The African Queen, the movie? Humphrey Bogart.
Close. Casablanca. It was Humphrey Bogart, Paul Heinried, Ingrid Bergman, and Claude Rains. So I wasn't gonna. That's, you know, that was in 1943, so that was a little bit before our time. But if you've never seen Casablanca, you definitely should see it. But that's beyond this. Okay, so now this is what I was talking about yesterday and totally mucked up. My apologies. I'll redo that. And so this, you're not responsible for this. In other words, I'm not going to ask a question about comparators and compare to stuff like that. Yeah, I do expect you to know that sorted sets will keep things in order. So strings are in alphabetical order, numbers are in numerical order, lowest to highest, and the difference between lists and sets, you know, that I am making you responsible for because I totally screwed this part up yesterday. I'm not going to make you responsible, but just for completeness, the relationship between the comparable interface and the comparator interface, and kind of how to manipulate those was kind of being asked for here. So what I asked for is the default compare to method for integers sorts them in increasing order. So that's something that that I do expect you to know, at least that is a tree set or a sorted set, depending on, will, if it contains integers, then no matter how I put them in, it's going to only have, it's not going to have any duplicates, and it's going to keep them in increasing order. Now, what this is about is, okay, now, given that, what if I wanted to sort them in decreasing order rather than increasing order? You know, sometimes there's a case for that. So in order, one way to do that is to write a custom comparator. And the way to write a custom comparator is I have it implementing the comparator interface. And I have to put the integer there so it knows that it's comparing integers. Then the one method that interface requires is the compare method. And the two arguments would be, next week I'll talk about what this generic thing is about. So compare, the way to compare two integers. If by default, if I compare one to the other, they come out in increasing order. If I compare, if I kind of reverse, there are basically three ways of doing it. One is I can say the second one compared to the first one, and if I return that, then that will kind of reverse the order. That's one way. Another is that even though these are integer objects, this thing called autoboxing will let me just actually subtract the values. That will work as well. Or I can simply take the first one compared to the second one and return a minus. This will do exactly the same thing as this. So these are three ways to use the existing comparator, in this case that's in integers, and modify it a little bit. When we start working with strings a little bit, we'll see that we can take the default string compare to method and work with that, because the strings compare to method is actually I've called it alphabetical, but that's strictly speaking not entirely accurate, because the string comparator is actually lexicographic ordering, and in that ordering, all of the capital letters come before all of the lowercase letters. So a capital Z comes before a lowercase a. And in some cases, that's fine. But in many examples, if I have words that say I want to keep sorted, but they're mixed case, I don't want lexicographic ordering. I want want all the A's to be together, whether it's uppercase or lowercase. And we'll look at ways of dealing with that. But again, for tomorrow, I'm not gonna ask a question that's as deep a dive like this into what that comparator and compared to stuff is all about. Mostly my own fault, but you're not responsible tomorrow for this. But it's still helpful to have to kind of understand that's what's going on under the hood.
Arnie, I had a question about the returns for those. So like you say it returns -1. So I mean, I get it's returning. So is that, I get it's like, I get it's returning something to change the position within the set, but what is it like? Is it returning a -1 to the like first in or the second in? Like, what does that mean exactly? It's a very poorly worded question.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
So you say, like, if you do the comparator and it returns a -1 or a +1 or a 0, it's just, what is it returning, like a positive or a -2? Like, is it sending? And I'm just trying to figure out, like, in my head, like, what is the computer doing? I think I kind of understand what the output would be. So if it's a negative, like, where is that -1 going?
That's in the logic of the tree set. When it's when you add something, let's say I add something in, it's a little more efficient than that. But supposing you had a bunch of cards that had numbers on them, and you're getting these cards one at a time, and your job is to keep them in sorted order. Now, I mean, how would you do that? Well, so you get the first card, you say you put it down. You get the second card. How would you decide whether to put that card before or after the first card?
Well, if it was lower or higher.
Exactly. So the compare to method will tell you whether this other card, this other object, is lower or higher, depending on whether compare to returns -1 or +1. If it returns -1, it means that the new one goes before the existing one, and if it's +1, it goes after.
Okay. And then so if you have if you have 3 cards down, and then they say, 4, 5, 6, and you drop a 2 on the table, it's going to iterate through each of those other cards to compare it to them. And well, put it at the beginning.
Well, no. What it uses an algorithm called a red-black tree. So what I'm describing is sort of a conceptual way of using the comparator, not literally what it does.
Okay, that's fine. I think that's good enough for now.
Yeah. So I mean, the exact way that it does it is fairly complicated. It uses something called, again, a red-black tree that it's way beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. But conceptually, it's like you need the ability to take 2 of these items and decide which one is bigger. And that's what the compare to does. The -1 says this one is bigger, and the +1 says the other one's bigger. And so that's what every sorting algorithm uses. Okay, so okay, so I'm looking through about a dozen. Okay, so this center line have. Oh, did I make a mistake in the?
I think you just missed a period in there, because this is what John was saying.
Oh, where was it? Oh, yeah, right here. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I'm getting the consensus. Okay, now about NetBeans, I'm getting the consensus about everybody's fine with no NetBeans. So since that's the consensus, we'll go with that, if that's yeah. But I will. I like your suggestion of the Word document, and so that's what we'll do. Again, if anything comes up, send me an email. I'll try to be monitoring it this afternoon, and all the best. I will post. I will schedule the thing to post a little bit early tomorrow, but I won't be there until probably right before 8. So, okay. So if there's nothing more, I will see you. Well, sort of see you tomorrow, and all the best with this.
Thank you.